In Chapter 2 of Church Why Bother, Philip Yancey uses metaphors to answer the question, what did God have in mind for the church? What's the church supposed to be? What's it supposed to look like? Paul did the same thing in 1 Corinthians, so we're going to start there and looking at the metaphors that he used. When Paul wrote his letters to Corinth, he was writing to a congregation composed of Jewish merchants, gypsies, Greeks, prostitutes, pagan idolaters. Paul battled church schisms, harangued them about a case of incest, and fought to keep the Lord's Supper from turning into a free-for-all. Corinth makes my church seem boring. Most scholars believe that Paul's letters to the Corinthians are some of the earliest books written in the New Testament. The first few chapters show the apostle struggling with a basic question. Just what is this thing called a church? What did God have in mind? The answer must have seemed elusive indeed to the unruly context of Corinth. Almost 20 centuries later, the answer still seems elusive to me. Now, Paul looked at he used some different examples, some different metaphors in 1 Corinthians to try to help the people identify with what the church should look like. The first one that he used is as a field. The church is as a field. So this is from 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 5 through 9. What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one, and each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. Now, this example made sense to the Corinthians because the city was surrounded by farms and vineyards, and they just went to the village to buy their produce from local farmers. So they could see the immediacy of planting and watering and then having things grow. Paul's next illustration was that the church is like a building, and this is from 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 10 through 15. According to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, and someone else is building upon it. Let each one take care how he builds upon it. For no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, or straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. In first century Corinth, you could buy a load of blocks and you could lay a foundation. You just needed to dig a ditch and know how to follow a straight line. It was pretty much that simple. The third illustration that Paul uses is as the church as a temple. And this is from 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 16 to 17. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. Now, these examples might have been relevant to the Corinthians, but they aren't so relevant to people that live in America in 2016. It isn't so easy for us to relate to the church as a field because most of us don't grow things in a field. We go to the grocery store and buy things that are already washed and pre-wrapped and ready to eat. We also don't build our own foundations. If you want to lay a foundation now, you need a permit and a contractor, and it's certainly a lot harder. So again, that metaphor loses its relevance for us. And as for the temple, I don't know any of us have built a temple, so that one probably doesn't work so well either. Paul continues in such a vein through the book until finally in chapter 12 he seizes upon the metaphor that fits best, the church as God's body. I believe that we have in 1 Corinthians a record of Paul thinking out loud, trying out ways of describing this thing called church. Each new metaphor casts a different light on the subject, and the last one, the body, seems the most accurate description of all. Paul spends an entire chapter exploring physiological parallels, and his letters return to that same metaphor more than 24 times. The following illustrations are some of the author's updated versions of what the church might look like in 2016. The first one that he used is that God's 12-step group. And in this example, the author is telling us that he has a friend that invited him to go along to AA with him, and this was his experience. "Come along," he said, "and I think you'll catch a glimpse of what the early church must have looked like." At 12 o'clock on a Monday night, I entered a ramshackle house that had been used for 6 other sessions already that day. Acrid clouds of cigarette smoke hung like tear gas in the air, stinging my eyes. It did not take long, however, to understand what my friend had meant with his comparison to the early church. A well-known politician and several prominent millionaires were mixing freely with unemployed dropouts and kids with needle marks on their arms. Introductions went like this: "Hi, I'm Tom, and I'm an alcoholic and a drug addict." Instantly, everyone shouted out warmly, "Hi, Tom." The sharing time worked like the textbook description of a small group, marked by compassionate listening, warm responses, and many hugs. Each person attending gave a personal progress report on his or her battle with addiction. We laughed a lot and we cried a lot. Mostly, the members seemed to enjoy being around people who could see right through their facades. There was no reason not to be honest. Everyone was in the same boat. Now, something we need to realize about Alcoholics Anonymous is that the founders believed that their program would only work best if it stayed at the most basic level, and that meant one alcoholic devoting his or her life to help another. They also insisted that dependence on God be a mandatory part of the program, and part of the 12 steps that they recite is acknowledging total dependence on God for forgiveness and strength. So God is involved in Alcoholics Anonymous, but of course it's not actually a church. The author's friend freely admits that AA has replaced the church for him, and this fact sometimes troubles him. AA groups borrow the sociology of the church along with a few of the words and concepts, but they have no underlying doctrine, he says. "I miss that, but mainly I'm trying to survive, and AA helps me in that struggle far better than any local church." Others in the group explain their ecclesiastical resistance by recounting stories of rejection and judgment. A local church is the last place they would stand up and declare, "Hi, I'm Tom. I'm an alcoholic and a drug addict." So this comes back to some of the barriers that we talked about in the first week. If we're hypocritical and we pretend that we don't have anything wrong with us, others aren't going to be comfortable coming to us and sharing what's going on in their lives. So the author asked his friend the one quality missing from the local church that AA had somehow provided. He stared at his cup of coffee for a long time, watching it go cold. I expected to hear a word like love or acceptance or knowing him, perhaps anti-institutionalism. Instead, he said softly this one word: dependency. "None of us can make it on our own. Isn't that why Jesus came?" he explained. Yet most church people give off a self-satisfied air of piety or superiority. I don't sense them consciously leaning on God or each other. Their lives appear to be in order. An alcoholic who goes to church feels inferior and incomplete. He sat in silence for a while until a smile began to creep across his face. "It's a funny thing," he said at last. "What I hate most about myself, my alcoholism, was the one thing God used to bring me back to Him. Because of it, I know I can't survive without God. I have to depend on Him to make it through each and every day. Maybe that's the redeeming value of alcoholism. Maybe God is calling us alcoholics to teach the saints what it means dependent on Him and on the community on earth." So church is a place where I can say unashamedly, I don't need to sin. I need another sinner. Perhaps together we can keep each other accountable on the path. From my friend's Midnight Church, I learned the need for humility, total honesty, and radical dependence on God and on a community of compassionate friends. As I thought about it, these qualities seemed exactly what Jesus had in mind when he founded the church. The second metaphor we're going to look at is that the church as God's driver's license bureau. For us, that would be PennDOT. I suspect that all of us instinctively gravitate toward people like us and rarely step outside that circle unless someone forces us to. Like in order to report to the driver's license bureau, or unless we meet such people at church. The author uses some illustrations here to help us to see how different people can benefit us in a church. And he talks about two people that he met in his childhood. He had Mrs. Ponce and Mrs. Peyton and Mr. Ponce. Mrs. Peyton was an older lady, and while his mother was teaching Sunday school, he would sit on her lap, and she wore two minks around her neck, which were very interesting for him to play with as a child. The two minks were biting each other's tails, and Mrs. Peyton was nice, but it seemed like he really enjoyed her minks the most. He also was friends with Mr. Ponce. Mr. Ponce had 6 children, and he was most happy when there was a child sitting on his lap. So during the services, the author would write, he would draw pictures in his bulletin, and Mr. Ponce would praise them, and Mr. Ponce would draw faces on his hands that would change and smile depending on how he moved his fist. So he remembers Mrs. Peyton and Mr. Ponce both as his friends. They were both very kind, and they were both important to him as a child. When he got older, though, he realized that he probably would not have been friends with them as an adult, because Mrs. Peyton was rich, and he might have been able to relate to her, but Mr. Ponce was a garbage truck driver, and he did not have very much money, and he wasn't very well educated, and the author realized that he probably would not have had a relationship with Mr. Ponce at all, because they would not have had anything in common. They would not have had anything to talk about. And he was so sad when he realized this. And he says, I am glad, very glad, that the Church of Jesus Christ in my childhood included both of these friends. I now see that the church should be an environment where both Mrs. Peyton of the hairy stole and Mr. Ponce of the hairy nose should feel equally welcome. And he says Mr. Ponce of the hairy nose because when he was sat on his lap, he would look up, and I guess he had a lot of nose hair. I should not have to wait 3 years for a trip to the driver's license bureau for a reminder of what the real world is like. The next example is that the church should be like God's urgent care center. I like to think of the church as one of those urgent care centers, open long hours, convenient to find, willing to serve the needs of people who drop in with unexpected emergencies. So an urgent care center is a place that you can go if you're sick, but you don't quite need to go to the emergency room. So they're much more convenient because you usually don't have to wait as long. Every one of us must contend with the normal human condition of loneliness, pride, occasional depression, fear, and alienation. Where can we take our minor scrapes and bruises and our major fractures and gaping psychic wounds? We can go to church. As I read the letters to the Corinthians again, I note that they contain, in addition to strong admonitions, some of Paul's most intimate words of loving concern. I have a hunch that Paul prayed more and fussed more over that church than he did over some of the more stable congregations he left around the Mediterranean rim. Corinth was an urgent care kind of church, and Paul wanted it to succeed precisely because the odds were stacked against such a cantankerous group of people. So, do we want to attract needy people to the church? The author says, I used to bristle when I heard someone accuse Christianity of being a crutch religion, a faith that attracted the poor and the crippled and those who could not quite make it on their own. But the more I read the Gospels and the prophets, the more willingly I admit to a crutch faith. Those who make such disdainful comments about Christianity are usually self-confident, successful overachievers who have made it on their own by looking out for number one without asking for help from anyone. Frankly, the gospel has little to offer people who refuse to admit need. Blessed are the poor in spirit, Jesus said, and those who mourn and the persecuted. Basic repentance requires me to come prostrate before God and admit that God, not I, is best qualified to tell me how I live. It's also helpful for us to remember that we are all broken. Even those of us in the church, we're broken. We need to seek healing and forgiveness from Jesus. And we come to him every Sunday to do that. The author talks about his experience with communion at his church and how that helped him to see other people as being broken and what it means to be healed. On several occasions, I had the opportunity to assist with a church communion service. The congregants came forward in groups and knelt on a prayer rail. I would break off a piece of bread, hand it to each person individually, and say, "The body of Christ broken for you." I did not know everyone, but I knew enough to recognize in these, my fellow worshipers, a need for comfort and for healing. Women like Deborah, who had been abandoned by their husbands, Judy, who sent her paycheck back to India to support her large extended family, Josh, who had found no work since leaving a printing plant over his discomfort with the pornography they were producing, Sarah, a young woman with Lou Gehrig's disease who had to be carried to the front. The church is a place where we can bring our pain, for it was founded by the one whose body was broken for us in order to give us life. The one other thing that we talked about in class is even if we don't necessarily need the building of the church to be to be open long hours, convenient to find, willing to serve the needs of people who drop in with unexpected emergencies. But we need the people in the church to meet these needs. Next, we're going to look at the church as God's family. So first, I want to start by looking at how we earn status from institutions. And there are two words here that came up most often: competition and performance. We work hard, we perform, we get good grades, we get promoted at work, we get stripes and increase our rank in the military, and that's how we earn status. But in family, how do we earn status? All we have to do is be born. We earn a family's rights solely by birth. A child who produces little may actually receive more attention than the healthy siblings. And what this reminds us is that we need to be careful not to run the church more like a business institution than a family. Paul warns us against valuing one member of the church more highly than another. The eye cannot say to the hand, "I don't need you," and the head cannot say to the feet, "I don't need you." On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and the parts that we think are less honorable we treat with special honor, and the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty, while our presentable parts need no special treatment. But God has combined the members of the body and has given greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 21 to 26. So here, Paul's using his favorite metaphor for the church, the human body. But it might be a little hard to visualize how the family corresponds to that metaphor. So we're going to look at a situation that most of us are a little bit more familiar with. And this is a human family. Every family contains some successful individuals and some miserable failures. At Thanksgiving, corporate vice president Aunt Mary sits next to Uncle Charles, who drinks too much and has never had a job. Although some of the folks gathered around the table are clever and some are stupid, some ugly and some attractive, some healthy and some disabled, in a family, these differences become insignificant. Cousin Johnny seems to try his best to alienate himself from the family, but there is no practical way to drum him out. He belongs, like all of us, because we were born of the same ancestors and the same gene coil inside our cells. Failure does not cancel out membership. A family, said Robert Frost, is the place where, when you have to go there, they have to take you in. We talked in class that maybe God created human families to help us deal with people who are different than we are and to love them anyway. And we all know that families are not perfect. Human families are far from perfect. But what we're looking at here would be the ideal family, because that's what we're looking at as the ideal for the church. Families work best not by papering over their differences, but rather by celebrating them. A healthy family builds up the weakest members while not tearing down the strong. As John Wesley's mother put it, "Which child of mine do I love best? I love the sick one until he's well, the one that's away from home until she's back." Family is the one human institution we have no choice over. We get in simply by being born, and as a result, we are involuntarily thrown together with a menagerie of strange and unlike people. Church calls for another step, to voluntarily choose to band together with a strange menagerie because of a common bond in Jesus Christ. I have found that such a community more resembles a family than any other human institution. Henry Nouwen once defined a community as a place where the person you least want to live with always lives. His definition applies equally to the group that gathers each Thanksgiving and the group that congregates each Sunday morning. The next metaphor we're going to look at is the church as God's locker room. Now, Philip Yancey likes to watch NCAA college basketball tournaments, so that's where this metaphor is headed. He talks about how these college kids, probably 19 years old or so, they have all this pressure on their shoulders, and it seems to come down to the last couple seconds in the game about who wins and who loses. So this young person is standing on the line. They need to get the shot in. If they get it in, they're going to be the hero. If they don't, ooh. All the coaches are there, their teammates are there. There might be scouts from professional teams who are watching them, and there's so much pressure on them. So in this example, the author says he was watching a game, and this kid was on the free throw line. He was ready to shoot. He was crouched down. Everybody's cheering. Everybody's screaming at him. And then he got a phone call. So he had to walk away, and he didn't know what happened until he came back a minute or two later. So he wasn't sure if he was going to see this kid on top of his friend's shoulders victorious, or if he was going to see this team crushed because he hadn't gotten it in and they had lost the game. These two freeze frames, the same kid crouching at the free throw line and then celebrating on his friend's shoulders, came to symbolize for me the difference between law and grace. Under law, my destiny rides on everything that I do. To please the crowd, the coach, the pro scouts, to please God, I have to make the shot. My eternity depends on it. If I miss, it will sear me forever. I have to make it. I cannot fail. Jesus' kingdom calls us to another way, one that depends not on our performance but his own. We do not have to achieve, but merely follow Jesus. He has already earned for us the costly victory of God's acceptance. As a result, church should not be one more place for me to compete and get a performance rating. Like a victorious locker room, church is a place to exalt, to give thanks, to celebrate the great news that all is forgiven, that God is love, that victory is certain. Church is a beacon of grace to the rest of the world, not a fortress of legalism. That is the church as described in the Bible, at least. This goes back to what we talked about in the first chapter and about grace and how no matter what we do, God won't love us more or love us less. So we need to remember to extend that grace to people that are inside of the church and to people that are out, because we have experienced God's grace. We can share it with other people. The next metaphor we're going to look at is God's welfare office. And this would be an institution set up to heal the blind, set free the captive, feed the hungry, and bring good news to the poor, the original mandate Jesus proclaimed. Next is God's neighborhood bar. And this would be a hangout like the television show Cheers for people who know all about your lousy boss, your mother with heart trouble back in North Carolina, and the teenager who won't do what you tell him. A place where you can unwind, spill your life story, and get a sympathetic look, not a self-righteous leer. So now we've gone through all of these metaphors that can help us to see what the church could be like, ideally what the church should be like, in terms of what makes sense to us Americans instead of what makes sense to the Corinthians. But Paul settled on the body as the most accurate and appropriate metaphor as the church as Christ's body. He says the body is a unit, Paul says. Though it is made up of many parts, and though all its parts are many, they form one body. That's from 1 Corinthians 12:12. An eye, a hand, a kidney, a foot, a nose. The body works only by balancing the polar forces of unity and diversity, by bringing together people of all shapes and sizes who are nevertheless made one in Christ Jesus. So what have we learned from all of this? To me, the most important lesson from the body is this: we, you and I, form the primary representation of God's presence in the world. It is our job to show the world that God is alive, what God is like, what's important to him. Martin Luther calls us God's masks because the world cannot withstand the direct force of God's glory, he said. God uses human beings as the prime expression of himself. As I look around on Sunday morning at the people populating the pews, I see the risk that God has assumed. And I easily get discouraged because much of the time we give a very poor representation of what God is like. So if the church and individuals aren't doing a good job of representing God well, and we can't fulfill all of these metaphors because they're very idealistic, why bother trying? Why should we even bother with church at all? Because every church represents the promise of what the church could be, and it offers us a whisper of hope. We need to have an idea of what the church could look like in order for us to strive to get there. We humans cause God great pain, yet God remains passionately involved with us. Should not I have something of that same attitude toward the church around me?